So welcome everybody. I'm delighted to invite Carrie Seltzer, who's going to be talking to us about iNaturalist Citizen Science Project. And Carrie's also been quite heavily involved with the AfriBats project. And we'll be able to talk to you about that, and you can ask some questions. So please feel free throughout the talk to post your questions in chat, and there'll also be an opportunity afterwards if you'd like to ask your questions directly. So over to you. Thank you very much, Carrie.
Great, thank you for the introduction. I am going to start sharing my screen. And I'll explain a little bit about my background too and my connection. I want to start with a disclaimer that I don't really consider myself a bat person. Though I did do some research with bats. My background is as an ecologist. I did fieldwork in Tanzania with my Tanzanian mentor and advisor, and I worked in the East Usambaras. I went into grad school thinking that I was going to do a project that was really about sort of half about bats and half about the plants that they interact with. And as things developed, I just ended up working more and more and more with plants and less with bats. So I think I became a little bit of an accidental botanist, and my main contribution to the field was a paper called Seed Dispersal in the Dark, and documenting many of the bat dispersed species in the East Usambaras. But unfortunately, because I was really focused on the things that the bats left behind in the forest, I really couldn't identify exactly which bats were doing the dispersal, just that there were fruit bats dispersing quite a lot of species in that forest. So I recognize some of your names, but I apologize. I feel like I'm a little bit of an outsider to this community, but I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm always excited to encourage this community and anyone who's excited about biodiversity to explore iNaturalist more. So after I finished my PhD, I was basically like straight out of academia. I started working for National Geographic, and that's how I ended up collaborating closely with iNaturalist. And for the last 2.5 years or so, I've been working directly for iNaturalist. And I've also been involved a bit with the AfriBats project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to give a sort of overall introduction to iNaturalist and give some examples of how it's being used already for bats and what some of the opportunities are. So thank you all for your time today. So first of all, iNaturalist is a social network where people share and record observations of biodiversity and crowdsource species identifications. So the first step is someone making an observation, then sharing it on iNaturalist. And each observation is really an invitation to have a conversation about what it is that you saw. And many times that conversation takes the form of successive identifications or confirming identifications. And collectively, all of the observations that people have added to iNaturalist enable a lot of discovery and exploration, new ideas, and research. So an observation on iNaturalist contains 5 key elements. You need to have an iNaturalist account. You don't have to associate your real name with it, but you do have to have an account, just like any other social media platform. We need to know where you saw it for it to be a complete record, so it has to have coordinates associated with it. There are ways of hiding the precise location, and I can talk a little bit more about that. We need evidence of what you saw in order for it to be confirmed by the community. So overwhelmingly on iNaturalist, people use photos, but you can also use sounds. We need to know when you saw it and this piece of what you saw. So what you saw, if you don't know, it can be as general an identification as plants, like I don't know what kind of plant it is, but I know it's some kind of plant. And then the the community can help refine that, correct it, or confirm it. But those are the key elements. I want to emphasize that iNaturalist works across platforms. I'm going to be focusing today a lot in my screenshots on the browser-based experience, because that is the most powerful, has the most features, but it is available, the iNaturalist app is available for iOS and Android. And when you're out making observations, I'd say that's what a lot of people use for making observations, but then a lot of the deeper exploration for most people happens through the web browser. But it's all interconnected. So the way the crowdsourcing of identifications works in iNaturalist is that you can start with something with a very coarse classification, and then over time, ideally, the community will refine it. So what this does is allow people who maybe don't know anything about bats to share an observation, and then once it gets identified as a bat, then it's easier for the folks who have bat expertise to be able to find it and further the identification. So this means that iNaturalist has an underlying taxonomy that allows for this progressively finer, hopefully, identification process. Sometimes sometimes observations can't be identified to species. That happens especially for a lot of insects or other arthropods, and that's okay. We encourage people to identify as precisely as they can, given the evidence available. I know that can be really dissatisfying sometimes for an observation that you share not to get identified to the species level, but I think we all understand that there's limitations in terms of evidence. So I think one of the really cool things about separating the observation process and the identification process is that it allows for this amazing intersection of skills and opportunity. So most people are observing in a fairly small geographic area, but when it comes to taxonomic expertise, that may be global. So this is really where iNaturalist as a global platform really shines, because you have this, sorry, bird just hit my window. It flew away though, I think it's okay. When you've got these taxonomically focused people with expertise, they can really explore observations from around the world. But you've got these geographically focused observers who may not readily have access to someone with that area of expertise. So this may make sense looking at a particular example. Susan Hewitt is a very active observer and identifier on iNaturalist, and the map on the top shows where in the world Susan has made observations. These are places she has visited or where she lives in New York City, and you can see it's a handful of spots. But Susan is a malacologist with broad expertise. She especially loves to identify seashells. And so she has identified observations from all over the world, and she can never visit all of those places, but the expertise that she has is useful for people in all of those places. So what all of these identifications and observations with photos have enabled is the training of a computer vision model that can suggest identifications based on visual similarity. So we've used about 18 million photos identified by at least one other person to train the model that we have right now, and it can suggest identifications for about 20,000 different taxa. So the way, to give you a sense of how this works, this is a violet that I photographed in my neighborhood, and this is showing a screenshot from the app. So based on the first image in an observation. It will look at which other species are visually similar to that and give you some suggestions. We always recommend that people take these as suggestions and click into the little eye symbol to get more information about the particular species, because sometimes it will suggest things that may not necessarily have been seen nearby. So always investigate. But this can provide a really useful starting place for someone who really has no idea what they're looking at. We think of it as sort of jump-starting the identification process, so it definitely can lead people astray. So with that brief overview of some of the key aspects of iNaturalist, I want to get into addressing these questions of how you can use it. There's a lot of different ways that people interact with iNaturalist, and everyone's got their own sort of emphasis. But first of all, I think that exploring all of the data that already exists is a great place to start. So if you go to iNaturalist.org, you land on the homepage. You can, there's a couple places where you can hit explore here, but once you do, for example, in the header, if you hit explore, it will take you to the map of the world with all of the observations by default. This is a screenshot from earlier this morning, and we've got almost 40 million observations now, including all taxa, across the world. 279,531 species have been identified to species. There are surely many, many more than that that have not yet been identified to this species level for many of the reasons that we know things may not be able to be identified to the species level. So this is an overwhelming place to start. So I recommend using the species search or the location search to narrow things down. So for example, if we go to just bats, then we're down to just 32,000 observations of bats of 762 species. So let's restrict that even further, and let's look at just bats in Africa. Now we're down an order of magnitude again, and we've got 203 species. So these major numbers across the top are also clickable. So you can take a species-centric view of it. This will, by default, start with the most observed species in that geographic and taxonomic area. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the straw-colored fruit bat. Then if we want to see who is active on iNaturalist, who has been identifying all of these African bat observations, it's overwhelmingly Jakob Fahr, followed by Natalie and me a bit. Mostly those are observations of Eidolon, for the record. And then you can also see who has been active in adding those observations. And here there's quite a bit more of a spread. There are over 1,000 people who have added observations of bats in Africa. And here's an example of one of those. So Doten 55 in Nigeria got these cool shots of the straw-colored fruit bat. He is one of the more active contributors to bat observations in Africa. And when you come across a cool observation, you can click on someone's profile to read more about them. I think he's a pretty good example of someone who is a general nature enthusiast, and he takes pictures of lots of things, and bats are just one of those. But he's made many observations, especially of Eidolon and of roosts around Nigeria. Here's a pretty awesome photo. And I wanted to highlight here a couple of things about this. One is that the precise observation of this location has been obscured. This box that you can see, that blue box, that indicates that the true location is somewhere in that box, but but for mapping purposes, the location has been assigned as that blue dot randomly within that box. So what this does is the record still contains the precise location, and that location is visible to the original observer and to other people that that observer has trusted with the precise location, or projects that have been trusted with that precise location. But publicly, anyone who goes to this page will only see the obscured location. So this is a way that iNaturalist protects precise locations, either for personal privacy or for the privacy of the species. And if you click into details, which I didn't get a screenshot of here, it will explain if it has been obscured because the person chose for it to be obscured, or if it has been obscured automatically by the system because this is a threatened species that needs protection. For example, I obscure all of the observations that I make from my house, even if it's something really boring and common, for my own personal privacy. So I think that's important for people to remember because the data that you share with iNaturalist is open and publicly shared by default. Another thing that I want to point out about this particular observation, I just wanted to, I think, highlight this particular user. So CCL Borneo, if you click into their profile, this is someone who has just visited Africa. They're actually based in Borneo. And so we have a number of highly active folks who I think fall into this sort of category of nature enthusiasts who are widely traveled and may have a broad focus or may have a different focus than the particular observation that you come across. This person expressed an interest in pitcher plants, but they're generally curious people, and so they'll make observations of other things they come across as well, like those really cool bats. Another way to use iNaturalist is tracking and sharing your own records. So I wanted to give a few examples of the kinds of things that you can share on iNaturalist, and again emphasize that you can upload past photos using the web browser. We have a bulk upload tool. I highly recommend that if you've got several old photos that you want to upload. Or when you're out and about, or photos you've got on your phone, you can use the app or a tablet. You can upload bones. You can upload recent evidence of a living organism. So this particular observation is from bones that were found in an owl pellet. So what's interesting here is that you've got an interaction as well, because it's not just about the bat, it's also about what ate the bat. So I thought this was a pretty neat example. Roadkill as well. Roadkill can be really important records. You can also upload sound. Sound is much less common on iNaturalist, but it is possible. If you want to upload sound, you can do it within the Android app, but not the iOS app, or you can upload sound files through the web, which I think is what most people do. So this is a recording of Epimaphorus wahlbergi, and you can clearly hear its pings, and otherwise it contains all of the same. The only difference here is that it's sound instead of photo. And I wanted to mention here, I wanted to mention Echometer. This is a post on a project that I'm going to mention. I haven't tried this yet. I have an Echometer Touch. I haven't figured out yet how best to share those in iNaturalist. And I know that many of you may have this problem as well. So I wanted to highlight this. I'll share a direct link as well so that folks can navigate directly to this and watch the video. Yeah, lots of ways to get your data into iNaturalist. I also wanted to highlight that you may want to especially if you're stuck at home because of coronavirus, you may want to try and BioBlitz your yard. I have a small yard in Washington, D.C., but I've found over 400 species in it so far over the last few years, and it's something that I really enjoy. I also record, I'll say iNaturalist is primarily for wild organisms, and the community is overall much more interested in identifying wild organisms than identifying garden plants. However, for purposes of phenology and my own record keeping and interest, I do also record usually the first bloom of my cultivated plants, which is why I have so many daffodil observations, and actually why I have so many purple passionflower observations. Purple passionflower is native to the DC area, but I have it planted in my yard because I love it and it's delicious. So that's another example of what you can do personally with your own records. But you can also use iNaturalist to build community. And an example of that is the AfriBats project. So over many years, I think almost 10 years now, Jakob has worked really hard to recruit people who have added photographs on Flickr, for example, encourage them to add them to iNaturalist, and has been very active in identifying the observations that come in for bats globally, but especially for African bats. And so projects are a way that you can bring together some kind of focus, either geographic or taxonomic or both, and provide a place for people to have posts and share observations, and also provide some additional information that may not be contained in the core observation fields. Back at the beginning, I emphasized that there's only 5 key elements of observation, but things like, you can imagine how additional fields like, was it a day roost or a night feeding roost, may be the kinds of questions that you'd want to answer. And what we call traditional projects on iNaturalist are a way of getting at that. The AfriBats project basically contains observations of bats from Africa and the surrounding islands. And so the project page, this is just scrolled further down, has a map where you can see that, and you have sort of a little blog within the project. And then there are some additional tools that you can see, and because I'm one of the admins on this project, I have these additional tools available to me as a project curator. Another example of a project on iNaturalist is the Global Bat Watch project. Pretty self-explanatory, bats from all over the world. So you can see in a more global way who is most active, who's added the most observations, which species are most commonly observed, and the same kinds of things here. So I wanted to show just another example of maybe the kind of bat observation that might pop up on iNaturalist. And this may be the kind of thing that if you're well known as the local bat expert, this may come to you by email, right? This is a bat that ended up in someone's pool, unfortunately. They fished it out with the pool net, took some photos of it, and they posted it to iNaturalist. And this is where I think iNaturalist can be pretty awesome for researchers, because these are the kinds of records that can be really hard to pull together. But iNaturalist, through the filters and the searching and the crowdsourcing of species identifications, makes it possible to find these little chance occurrences that otherwise might just end up in someone's inbox and not really able to be shared or used in the same kind of way. You can also correct misidentifications. I'm very upfront that there are mistakes on iNaturalist all the time, but they can always be corrected. And that's the power of building a community around a certain place or a certain taxon, is that then you've got people who can share their expertise, help other people develop their expertise, and correct misidentifications fairly quickly. So this is an observation of a bat from Malawi, but someone added, very oddly, an Artibius identification to this observation. Thankfully, there were many other correct identifications that essentially override this misidentification. So that's the power of having many experts involved, better data. So you can use iNaturalist data for research. And you can download data directly from iNaturalist, but I want to emphasize one of the main way I think that most people use data from iNaturalist, and that's because it's shared with the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Once a week, approximately, we update a data set with GBIF that contains all of the observations that are openly licensed, that have this research grade status, which we define as identified at the species level without disagreement, or at least 2/3 agreement at the species level if there is a conflicting identification. So the coolest thing about sharing data with GBIF is that it makes it much more broadly accessible. And then once it's shared with GBIF, when people download data from GBIF, if their data set that they download contains any records from iNaturalist, that's sort of information that's maintained in their system. And each GBIF download contains a digital object identifier. And when you publish based on GBIF data, you should cite the digital object identifier. You can even see here, if you want to cite the whole iNaturalist data set, there's this how to cite DOI. Can you guys see my cursor?
Oops. Yes, we can. Thanks, Carrie.
Okay, great. So what this enables is that when someone cites a data set that contains iNaturalist data, GBIF is able to pull that information back out for us here, and we can see that so far 610 publications have cited a data set that contains at least one record from iNaturalist. So just to be clear, because we share this data with GBIF, we have more insight into how it's being used in research downstream than we have from the data that's downloaded directly from iNaturalist. So we've recently been trying to improve our communications about this so that researchers, even if they're getting the data directly from iNaturalist, can download a corresponding data set from GBIF and cite that so that we're better able to track the research products that come out of the data. I also wanted to highlight another cool tool that we share observations with, which is, it's called globalbioticinteractions.org, or GLOBI for short. And what GLOBI does is look for observations on iNaturalist that have certain additional fields added to them called observation fields that capture interactions. So for example, the owl pellet is a good example. So that observation, I didn't check to see if this is correct, but it could have an observation field of interaction eaten by, and then have the barn owl identification. With that additional piece of information, that record can get pulled into globalbioticinteractions.org, and when someone searches either for that bat or for barn owls, that interaction will appear. So I don't think the map is working on GLOBI right now, or maybe there were just too many records for it to display properly. But what I did was I searched for Chiroptera on GLOBI, and it pulls up all of the taxa that bats are recorded to have interacted with. So this could be plants, and in the diagram below, you can see that there are a lot of plants recorded here, that there's also quite a lot of interactions with birds recorded as well. So if you're interested in interactions, I definitely encourage you to check this out. And if you want to know even more about iNaturalist, we've got some additional resources about getting started, more about getting started and exploring observations, more about identifying. And we've also got a forum, and the forum is where people go to talk about iNaturalist, not to post things that need to be identified, because that's what iNaturalist is for, but talking either questions about features, reporting bugs, requesting new features that don't exist yet, things like that. And lastly, I created a little project for this group on iNaturalist. We've got this newer style of project as well. This is called a collection project. And what this does is just very simply use filters to collect observations. And in this case, how it will filter is by people who have joined the project. So I encourage you, if you search on iNaturalist for Winged Wednesday webinar, you'll find this project. And then if you join it, any observations that you make during this month of June will automatically be added to this project. So I thought this would be a fun way for anyone who's attending the webinar to be able to see observations made by anyone else attending the webinar. And they don't have to be bats, because I know you might not all be able to observe bats this month, but I just thought this would be a neat way for us to see what everyone finds, wherever in the world you are. And very lastly, I really want to acknowledge the iNaturalist community, because iNaturalist wouldn't work without all the people who share their observations and share their expertise. And I'm just part of the team that helps maintain the infrastructure, but it's all the people who use it who make it what it is. So I think we've got time for questions, and I would love to answer them.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Carrie. That's much appreciated. So we had a question from Quincy, who's just asking, how could he set up his own project? So that's quite timely with your last one. Yeah, sure. So can I ask Quincy, do you have an iNaturalist account yet? He does, yeah. So Quincy, if you want to come, you feel free to unmute yourself if you can.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yes, so I do have an iNaturalist account. Actually signed up today.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So so there's a couple things to know. First is that you can make a collection project of this kind that I showed. This is sort of this fits most people's needs. This is useful for a time-bound project, or a project for a specific taxon or a specific place. But in order to make the kinds of projects that AfriBats and Global Batwatch have, there's a couple thresholds that you have to meet. Before you can make one of those kinds of projects, you have to have added at least 50 observations of your own that are verifiable. So they have to have complete data, and they have to be of non-captive organisms. So for someone who's really focused, this can usually be done in a day with either past photos that you've taken or going out and exploring your neighborhood if you're able. I personally am a big fan of sidewalk weeds. I love documenting and getting to know all of the sidewalk weeds wherever I am. I've gotten to know quite a few of them in Washington, D.C. But the reason we have that threshold in place is because the core part of iNaturalist is really making and identifying observations, and projects are are secondary to that. So we want to make sure that anyone who is undertaking a project really has a handle on that observation experience before they get too deep into projects.
Okay.
Another thing to keep in mind is a place. So can I ask, the project that you want to make, is it place specific?
Well, well, my island is quite small. The population is not that much person here in Grenada, and I was thinking probably the forest reserve that we have here
Okay.
could be an ideal location. Yeah.
Cool. So if you want to limit, I'll say when it comes to places, iNaturalist has every country in the world and then 2 levels below country. So in the United States, that means iNaturalist also has all of the states and all of the counties within the states, but it doesn't have municipalities. So it doesn't have cities separate from counties or things like that.
Okay.
So we've got those 2 levels for every country in the world, whatever those levels are called. And so if there is a level like that that corresponds to your island, then you could use that place already and assign that. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing, though, that there is not already the boundary of that specific forest reserve in iNaturalist, which can be added by creating a new place. However, again, you have to meet that 50 observation threshold before you can add a new place. And the sort of the technical justification for that is that adding places to iNaturalist adds a level of sort of computational burden to the site infrastructure. And so we want to make sure that the places that get added are really going to be used by the community. We've really tried not to, aside from the major political geographic boundaries, we rarely, for example, will like bring in a whole park system, because we find that the organic growth of someone adding a forest reserve boundary, for example, because they want to help, they want to use that to help cultivate the community, is a more effective approach rather than bringing in a lot of places that no one exactly has ownership of at that time.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So Min has also asked, can you upload morphological photos? So for example, she's put bats stuck down on a mat and taken photographs and measurements. How could you upload those?
Yeah, so that may be sort of analogous to like pinned insect observations that get uploaded to iNaturalist. So you can, and they would just be added as any other observation with evidence. I don't think I emphasized this, but an observation can have multiple photos associated with it. And we do encourage that, because oftentimes you can't get a fully identifiable observation without having those multiple views.
Great, thank you. And then Hanani was asking, how long does it usually take for GBIF to import the data that's been posted on iNaturalist?
Cool, yeah. So once an observation reaches research grade, then the next time that we share data with GBIF, assuming it has the appropriate Creative Commons licenses associated with it, and if that doesn't make sense, I can also go into that more, but to focus on that GBIF question, I think right now we run that every Thursday night, and there are occasionally issues that happen where it may not work for a week or two, but generally it will be within about 2 weeks that an observation gets to research grade, and then it'll be shared with GBIF.
Great, thanks very much, Carrie. And then we have a question from Kate, and she was saying, can we only upload individual observations, or is there a way to upload spreadsheets or databases, for example, long-term monitoring data? This could be a platform to use as a repository for bat activity data. I know you've helped me with this, so there is.
Yeah, so we do have a CSV uploader. If you are on the web and you go to the upload tool, which will take you to the bulk uploader. You can drag multiple photos on there at once, or you should be able to click and see other options. So we have this CSV import tool. It's fairly particular in its formatting requirements, and we are also talking about the possibility of removing it because it has been a little bit problematic. So there's a few things I want to emphasize when it comes to past records and spreadsheets and things like that. Because spreadsheet data won't have photos associated with it, there's not that same potential for interaction around and conversation around the identification, because there's no photographic or sound evidence associated with it. So by default, we don't automatically surface those observations in the way that we do with observations with photos, and they tend to be a lot more error prone. It has value from the personal perspective, and I know that those can be a source of reinvestigation. If someone's really digging into all the data in a place, they may see like, oh, I wonder if that's something that we might be able to go back and resurvey for. But we really want people to think about iNaturalist first and foremost as a kind of living data set and a place for really thriving interaction, rather than a repository for old data. If this is data that you feel very strongly about, it's your data, and you're excited about continuing to steward it and having that be part of your identity on iNaturalist, then please do upload it. But what we find is not as helpful is, for example, to create a separate account that only exists to upload past data without any photos or sounds associated with it. That doesn't seem to be as effective in helping build the community compared with photo or sound-based observations. Sorry, that was a long answer. The short answer is yes, you can do that.
Excellent, that's great, thank you very much. And Francesca was just asking, is it possible to filter the not confirmed observations, so the not reliable observations?
Yes, definitely. So that other category of observations is called needs ID, and yes, you can focus only on those. Those are the ones that need identification attention. And I didn't really go into the identification tools, but we've got onboarding materials to help you with that, and we definitely welcome identification expertise to help get those observations to research grade.
Great, thank you very much. And then Ram has a question saying, in some cases, a few observations are rare, and probably such observations are also restricted with environmental conditions, such as heat shock mortality of flying foxes. And how can you kind of use such data? How can that data be uploaded to iNaturalist?
Are you talking about like temperature data in addition to the observation itself?
Yeah, so actually, Ram, I'm not sure if you're, if you feel free if you want to unmute yourself to ask Carrie directly. So I'm not sure if you, if you mean the temperature data, or if you actually mean the, there's sometimes we have, photographs of mass mortality of bats.
Maybe while Ram is trying to unmute to clarify, I'll just, I'm live showing the iNaturalist website now and the filters. So there's a lot of additional filters you can put in here, including this needs ID category. So There's 14,000 observations of bats from around the world that still need further identification. So you can make this more geographically specific. I'm going to focus in on Grenada since it was mentioned earlier. And you can click into this observation. And in this case, it's already been identified 2 species. It just needs someone with expertise to agree with it. And in this case, it's been waiting for 2 years. Sometimes observations sit for a long time on iNaturalist before the right person comes along with the expertise needed to confirm. So if that's you, you can hit agree, or if this has been misidentified, you can type an alternative suggestion. And if you tap into that box, it will give you suggestions based on visual similarity, some of which may be wildly incorrect, but can provide a starting place.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carrie. That's really useful. And we are going to be looking at possibly doing like a bit of a training course on how to use this and for your research as well. So I'll email out to see how much interest there is in that. But Ram, are you able to speak to Carrie now? I think maybe he's having difficulties. Maybe you could type if you just want clarification. So we weren't sure if you meant actual, the photos of bats, fatality of bats, or the temperature conditions. But maybe Carrie, you could talk about both.
Yeah. So certainly you can post observations of dead organisms, and you can note the conditions of their death if you know them. I, for example, have some observations of Eidolon helvum on electric wires. When it comes to additional data that isn't captured in those core observation fields, like temperature, for example, you can add an additional observation field for the air temperature that day or at that time. But I would say it's fairly uncommon that people add temperature data to their observations. It's a little bit more common for the herps. There are some projects that ask for that, but in general, I would say that's pretty rare. I hope that might have addressed your concerns.
I'm sure Ram will come back if he has an additional questions. Please feel free to do that. And yeah, and also for the AfriBats project, there's quite a few different criteria. So for instance, it'll ask what kind of roost, the numbers of bats. So there's actually specific questions as well, which gives quite a lot of information that you'd then be able to see. And then we had a question from Melissa. Are there certain places in the world where an observation would be seen as a scientific research and falls between a grey area requiring permits that we need to look out for?
That's a good question. And I would say that varies considerably geographically and taxonomically. In general, I think that if you are handling vertebrates, that is one of the times when permits start to be required. I think a lot of so there's some observations on iNaturalist that are happening as part of permitted research, and then probably there's a lot more observations that are happening sort of more casually. And when it comes to bats, I think there's probably a really clear distinction, a much more clear distinction between those two because of the additional safety and permitting considerations, right? You can't just set up a mist net anywhere and catch bats, especially when it comes to parks. I can speak a little bit to the National Park Service in the United States. Their handling vertebrates is overwhelmingly considered an activity that you need a permit for. I hope that scratches the surface a little bit.
Yes, and I would say for most of, across Africa as well, we would all need a permit for handling, vertebrates too. Well, and in some cases invertebrates. Yes, I was just wondering, going back to sort of, you're saying about the sound file. So there was obviously a call from a fruit bat, but has there been quite a lot of echolocation calls that have been uploaded? And would you encourage people to put a sound file on, but also the sonograms for echolocation calls?
Yeah, so let's filter and take a look. So also I want to come back to that particular one. So let's look at the AfriBats, and let's look for ones that have sounds. And let's not restrict it to the AfriBats project. Let's look globally. So yes, you can see that sometimes people are including an image of the sonogram in addition to the sound recording itself. Yep, so I encourage you to do this filter, has sounds, AfriBats, globally, and see some examples of what people are doing and how they're doing it. And you can look at who's doing it and maybe get some tips from them.
Excellent, that's great. Thank you very much. And I know, so Malawi, well, there were 6 countries across Africa were part of a GBIF, big data project, because at the time, a couple of years ago, 90% of all biological records actually came from South Africa. So a big plug to all of you across Africa. We want to increase our records. I mean, it's great to see them coming in from South Africa, but we also want to keep our competition going. But I was just wondering, so I was a bit unsure because I wanted to add some of my records, but I obviously wanted to also support the Malawi project for my records in Malawi. And is it possible to actually put your records into, or projects, for instance?
Yeah, so for example, overwhelmingly though, definitely the most important thing is to get it on iNaturalist with complete data and a correct location, because then you can search for all the observations from Malawi. Oh wait, sounds, that's the filter with sounds, okay. Here, this is just all observations from Malawi across all taxa. And you can see where they've been made in Malawi. But then once you've got it up there with all the correct data, then you can also choose to add it to certain projects. There are these collection projects that will add it automatically. For example, the Winged Wednesday project. Let's see if anyone has anyone joined it yet? This kind of project will bring observations in automatically. So anything that's just filtering on certain criteria, that'll happen automatically. When it comes to a traditional project like AfriBats though, observations either need to be added, they need to be added by someone, usually by the observer, but in this case, since Jakob is so active in terms of watching the observations that come in of bats across Africa, he'll usually reach out to people. If they don't add it to AfriBats, he'll usually invite them to add it to AfriBats. And what I wanted to show here, this doesn't have the additional observation fields for AfriBats. I was trying to show an example of that. So yeah, the most important thing is get the observations up, and then if there are relevant projects, you can also add them to those projects.
Excellent. So I think there's been a couple of thank you very much, and as Nancy Simmons said, hugely informative presentation. Thank you very much. So we've got a couple of minutes left if anybody else has any questions. Yeah, so we're certainly very jealous about Susan Hewitt, who you mentioned earlier. So it sounds like we need, as a bat community, to be rallying round, not only to add our observations, but also to help identify calls. So maybe we can actually have a bit of a training session and get together people who will be willing to do that. And I think once people are trained up a bit more, but in the meanwhile, it'd be great if people join up and actually have a little practice as well. So I think Ram has been struggling. Shame, I think he dropped out and he's been trying to join again. But yeah, so thank you very, very much. And just to let everybody know, I forgot to say that Carrie is actually the Stakeholder Engagement Strategist for iNaturalists. And of course, if you want to get in touch with Carrie, I don't know if you'll be sharing your email at the end, or I can certainly put people in touch, or we can share it in your email address in chat.
Sure thing. I would be happy to put my email address in chat, or for you to share it in follow-up. It's just carrie@iNaturalist.org.
Excellent. So thank you very, very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And yeah, so we'll definitely, hopefully, we'll be getting lots more records from around Africa and the bat community globally. And thank you so much for your time. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining today.
Yes, thank you all.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.